One day, I shall come back. Until then...
No more. No. Stop it. No more. Stop that!
Look, I'm angry, that's new.
I don't like it. I don't like it.
Yeah, oh, you never do.
Wise or angry, what do you need now?
Oh, marvellous. What a finely tuned response to the situation.
Do you know what? Shut up. I am so sick of listening to Paul to Open.
Paul to Open?
Yes, and what do you do?
Will it hurt? You'll find that it's a very small universe when I'm angry with you. Good.
Hello, and welcome to Pull to Open, an ongoing quest to watch all of Doctor Who in random order. I'm Pete Paschal, and normally we are here to talk about an episode of Doctor Who, a story in the 60-year history now. But instead of that, since the next story we're supposed to do is the War Games, we are going to take a little bit of an interlude and talk a little bit about something that is rarely talked about in fan circles. It's the times we almost rage quit the show, or perhaps even did rage quit the show for various reasons.
Yes, and I'm Chris Taylor, and I have rage quit Doctor Who in my life long ago. We'll get to that, but we know that this is an issue. It's interesting doing this while watching the War Games, which you could argue that there's an element of the Doctor sort of almost rage quitting himself in that story. We've been to other stories where the Doctor kind of almost rage quit. Inferno might be the biggest one. He kind of almost tries to escape, and the show itself was almost cancelled. And but rage quitting. You can't rage quit something the way that Clara does in Kill the Moon. She almost rage quits the Doctor. You can't rage quit something, as Danny Pink points out, unless you really loved it in the first place. So I think that is what lies behind a lot of rage quitting, is our love for the show, and of course it is a show that changes a lot. So that's what we're going to dive into today, and we are going to talk about a little poll we've just put up online about your rage quitting the show, and we're also going to talk about the times where you didn't quite rage quit. There's sort of a lesser version, which, for want of a better term, I'm calling meh quitting, which is certainly what a lot of us have done at some point during the Chibnall era. Some folks have done during the Moffat era. Part of this was sparked by our guest, Dave Kitchen, from the Doctor Who show, mentioned the other week when we were watching The Doctor's Wife, and talking about The Doctor's Wife, that he rage quit immediately after that. Season 6 of the new show was difficult for a lot of people who didn't like the River Song storyline, and that was for Dave. That was his rage quit point, was roughly around Let's Kill Hitler. So obviously it's different for a lot of people.
Yeah. So first of all, I can think of no better term than meh quitting. There's a lack of a better term because there isn't one. So that's cool. Yeah, there's definitely meh quitting. You're a confessed rage quitter.
Yes.
And we've talked about that a couple of times on the show, and we'll get into when you rage quit and why. I'm not trying to brag or anything. I've never actually rage quit Doctor Who, but I have meh quit a couple of times, maybe even like more than like at least once in the classic series. Once, I think during we'll get into it, but other eras like the new series, arguably. But anyway, I think for this particular show, since it's very personal, I think both of us will be served well by putting on our journalism hats,
right,
and essentially interviewing the other person about when this rage quitting took place or meh quitting took place, and trying to probe the reasons behind it. So Chris, if you don't mind being the subject, perhaps the first subject of this interview format.
Absolutely. I will also say that we have a Twitter poll up. There are already responses coming in. People are replying to the poll with their own rage quit moments. So we'll read some of those out a little bit later. But in preparation for the show, I was kind of digging into my own history and trying to understand, because we talked about this. I believe we talked about this with the first appearance of the Rani. Because it was time in the Rani when I rage quit, and it was the Colin Baker to Sylvester McCoy regeneration. And I was thinking about this, and I didn't even watch Time of the Rani. I was so mad. I was so absolutely and utterly mad at the way that the regeneration was handled, at Sylvester McCoy in a Colin Baker wig. It seemed so much like a Curse of Fatal Death kind of moment, because the Curse of Fatal Death was not sort of the only comedy Doctor Who thing that was ever on the BBC in the 80s and 90s. There were comedy sketches. It was sometimes treated as sort of a laughable thing within the BBC's comedy division, and it sort of felt like the beginning of Time and Ronnie felt almost like a sketch of Doctor Who. It felt like one of those moments.
Yeah, Curse of Fatal Death came later, of course.
Yes, it did. It did.
I guess I would ask, try to put yourself in the mind of, how old were you at the time, I guess, when Time in the Rani was coming out?
Well, let's see.
Like
what was Time in the
1987,
Rani?
right?
87. So I would have been 13.
Okay.
And I think, I guess that is definitely a stage when we are very skeptical, very ready to tear down our childhood idols. But the more I thought about this, the more I realized, no, it wasn't just Time in the Rani. Mm-hmm. It was the unresolved problem that I had from the end of Trial of a Time Lord. Okay. And the unresolved problem was this: where in the hell did Mel come from?
Oh, yes, you've talked about this before. I remember, not even in the context of rage quitting, but when we were talking about Silence of the Library, Forest of the Dead, I asked you once about snapping the fingers and opening the TARDIS doors, and you said that was a Mel moment. So clearly this was a thing. I think it might just be you, but it's a term in your Doctor Who vernacular that has come to mean something. And then what does that mean, and why was that powerful for you?
Well, if you remember at the end of Trial of a Time Lord, that the last the story that the Doctor presents, and he's presenting his defense, and for some reason he's presenting a story from his future. And I don't believe that this is ever addressed in the show. It's just sort of taken as gospel that he can do this. I don't know why the Time Lords have let him look into his own future. He's never done it before. He's never done it since. It's a really bizarre thing to do. And it just sort of happened, right? And I couldn't let go of that essential fact of like, what is he's looking into his own future. And this it just seemed like a really lazy introduction for a companion. And of course, I was still mourning Perry from the previous episode, so I think that was probably mixed into it somehow. And it just felt like so super lazy that I felt like, something has changed here. Like Doctor Who has become lazy about its own lore, lazy about some sort of essential rules of time travel. Yeah, and so I felt like that prepared the ground, and then I think the next season started almost. I hadn't caught any of the hype, but just sort of started. It appeared in my Radio Times one day. There it was. Right. I was ready to start watching the next season.
And did you set aside time? Did you go? Time in the Rani's coming up, and you did make a point to watch it. Like you were still at this point a fan enough to watch new Doctor Who as it came out.
So far as I remember, I think it was much more tentative, and I hadn't followed any of the press stories about Colin Baker leaving, and I think I sort of vaguely knew that the show was in danger of being cancelled. I think we all sort of knew it, and it's funny. Dave Kitchen also mentioned this, and it took me right back to that. This was a very kind of tentative time for the show, right? And we all felt it, and we all felt like a certain kind of embarrassment and worry, like it was almost like our favorite relative is in danger of getting committed to an asylum. Let's hope that they don't embarrass themselves at this family gathering.
Well, it had already been on hiatus for a while.
Yes.
The Trial of Time Lord season. There was it sounds like you weren't paying too much attention to the behind the scenes stuff, but all the stuff with Michael Grade wanting to sort of kind of almost kill the show outright, you must have got some of that.
Yes, Michael Grade was definitely a name I knew. I knew that he was opposed to Doctor Who. I didn't follow. So many of the stories were in the tabloids, and we didn't get the tabloids. We got the broadsheets, we got the fancy newspapers. So I didn't, there was no way to read about it, really.
Just
there was no internet.
For listeners who may not know, Michael Grade was the controller of BBC in the 80s, and it's sort of an infamous story of how he seemed to really have it out for Doctor Who, thinking it was too cheap, too violent, too lame, and just bit by bit in the mid to late 80s kind of chipped away everything from the show until it was sort of put on permanent hiatus
right
in 1989. So that we don't have to get into all the details of that, but just so everyone's up to speed.
But it definitely, and Dave seems to have had the same experience. I think a lot of us had this experience at the time of just being like, oh God, oh please be good, Doctor Who, please be good. Please don't let Michael Grade cancel it. And please don't be a joke. Please don't let this fandom that I've put so much energy into become a joke. And I think that's what it was. It was internally inconsistent with the Mel thing, where she just it wasn't necessarily the fact that he's looking to a story in his own future. Like that was bad enough. But then she shows up in the trial of a Time Lord itself, and the Doctor just goes off with her, and it's like, okay, well, how did you meet her originally? Like, wasn't the show like really? Didn't it used to be really concerned with like fixed points in time, and
so
you can't rewrite history?
I actually have a lot to say about Mel and all the choices you're making, but we're not actually doing that story for the podcast right now. So I'd rather probe more you and your feelings here. So getting to Time in the Rani, I assume you sat down and watched that first episode and did witness the sort of non-regeneration, right?
I witnessed the non-regeneration.
Take me back to that moment and just literally like the feelings you had. I mean, had you heard about it? Did you know this was going to not be Colin Baker? And were you sort of mentally prepared for just kind of how bad it was, or were you just hit over the head with that?
I don't remember how prepared I was. I'm pretty sure that I knew Colin Baker was leaving. I don't remember the hoopla about Sylvester McCoy. But I do remember Sylvester McCoy from British TV in the 80s. He was a very popular figure on the BBC. But he was definitely kind of a comedian. There was a kids' TV show called Jigsaw that I remember him from. He was the best thing about it. I loved Sylvester McCoy. This is sort of the irony of it, that I loved him in other roles. But to see him suddenly become the Doctor, especially in that way, definitely struck me as, oh, this is a sketch. This is a sketch show. This is bad. And I think I rage quit in that episode. I think that I pretty much just turned it off. I do not remember the running at all.
So you didn't even wait for the credits?
I didn't. Maybe not, or maybe it was just after the credits, or maybe it was also seeing those McCoy credits. We've talked about those before.
Yeah,
how naff I found them. So I really think the more that I think back on it, the more it was like this. The ground had to be laid. I was kind of upset about the introduction of Mel, kind of upset there was Bonnie Langford also, because she was known for other things. She was known primarily for being a singer and variety star, and she was very often on the BBC herself. So it really felt like they were so desperate and pulling out all the stops, and so desperate that they'd just sort of forgotten the rules of time travel. Right. So that was the ground was laid by that, and then then the regeneration happens, and it happens so badly. I think even then I was aware that there must have been a better way to handle this.
Right.
So Colin Baker can't return. That much is obvious from that opening scene. For whatever reason, he hasn't been invited back. Then do something. Pick it up after the regeneration. It's ironic that we're talking about the war games in the next story. That was an example of how you handle it when the two Doctors can't be together, right? For a regeneration scene, you pick it up after the fact. So here was Doctor Who kind of handling it, I think, in the most unintentionally comedic way.
Mhm.
I believe the official explanation was he bumps his head on the console, right? That's how he regenerates.
Yeah, because there's no evidence of like an explosion or something. It
Yeah.
just looks like the turbulence or whatever from the Ronnie's. I don't forget what it is. It's like a tractor beam or something that pulls it in.
Yeah.
Has caused severe injury somehow to him, but not to Mel.
So that seemed really dumb in itself, especially after, Tom Baker died saving the universe.
Mm-hmm.
I saw that. Peter Davison died, in the caves of Androzani, in one of the best endings ever, saving Perry's life, right?
Yeah.
Really deep emotional stuff, so boom, boom. Next regeneration, he hit his head.
You're making a solid case.
Yes. I was just like, oh my God, I can't. Like, I think I sort of had to turn the TV off and just sort of sit with my fandom for a while and kind of just, oh God, Doctor Who's dead. Like, I had that moment. And I'm aware now this gives short shrift to the whole Sylvester McCoy era. And I think for a lot of people, I've talked about this on the show before. My wife was a fan who came on board with McCoy, who hadn't seen any of the preceding stuff. It didn't matter to her. It didn't matter to a lot of people. But yeah,
wait a minute. So you rage quit. You right in that moment, or just after, you're like turning the TV off or walking out of the room. I'm done.
Yep. Done.
And do you not watch a single episode of the McCoy era at all after that? Did you not even remember? You didn't even see Remembrance of the Daleks. Which is
maybe saw it is. It is. I have certainly seen it since. I may have watched bits of it at the time. Probably picked up on the sort of the press discussion around it. The bits that I caught of McCoy as Doctor, I guess I just decided that he wasn't the Doctor.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
That it just kind of, he didn't seem to fit the role for me. He just always seemed like the wrong kind of actor. I don't know if I'm heightist, which is ironic since I'm only 5'7" myself. But it just seemed McCoy just seemed like literally a come down from the previous Doctor.
All right.
Again, as I said, I loved him as a comedian. Didn't think that he had the right presence. Didn't sort of feel that he was a Doctor until I watched the TV movie, and I think something about seeing him on film kind of made him the Doctor for me, just in time for him to regenerate.
So it's interesting that you rage quit Doctor Who at the very end of its run, its classic series run. So yeah, I think you've sort of partially answered this just now, but I was curious on how you then basically renewed your fandom in some way, and maybe it's just time to reflect, or maybe New Who caught your attention quicker, or the TV movie. Was it like basically how did you find your way back?
I think I'd been so damaged by the time that Rose came along that, by the McCoy thing, by the TV movie, not living up to expectations. I was actually not a fan of Rose when it came out. I think I'd been twice bitten. I was twice bitten, and I was afraid that this was, just. It's like watching England in the World Cup, It's like, oh, this is clearly they're clearly going to get knocked out. Clearly my heart is going to be broken again. And I didn't think that RTD quite had it. I can look back on Rose now and see it's an excellent way to reintroduce it. But I watched it at the time, and I did not bother with the rest of season one. I did not pick it up again until a year later.
Rage quit wounds run deep.
It did, yeah. This was more of a mech quit. It was more of a mech quit, but it did not end until I went into, I remember this very distinctly, I went into a store in San Francisco, which is where I was living at the time. And it was a store that sells British goods. And I got talking to the guy behind the counter who turned out to be a huge Doctor Who fan. He was just so excited about the new series, wanted someone to share the excitement with. I mentioned that my experience of Rose had been meh. And he showed me the opening of, I believe it's Aliens in London. The Doctor comes back a year later. He showed me the cold open of that and was so enthusiastic about it. I was like, okay, yeah, I guess this new series has more to offer. And I think that I downloaded in a perhaps sort of slightly not approved way, because it was hard to get downloads in those days. We
I
forget.
think the statute of limitations on BitTorrent is over, right? I could be wrong.
Yes.
It's got to be like, where's the statute on copyright?
Oh
Yeah.
God, it was even pre BitTorrent. I think it was.
Oh,
It was
wow.
that old, but it was like LimeWire or Kazaa or something. Yeah, it was that kind of stuff. But yeah, at that point, I was like, okay, I got on board. Actually, the following year is when I met my wife, and we bonded over Doctor Who. I showed her that, some of the best episodes in the first and second seasons, and then it was just I was into New Who all the way from there.
And then that's it.
But yeah,
We're back.
yeah, and then that was it. But it's interesting remembering all of this, remembering that I sort of meh quit with Rose, and didn't pick it up again for a while.
Interesting. Yeah. So taking your experience, I guess, it's hard to sort of generalize because your rage quitting in the first place was about a very specific era of the show and where the show was particularly troubled. It's off screen, and then that inevitably led to on screen. I wonder if you can think about those feelings and maybe of mishandling and try to project a little bit about like what is sort of the general formula, not if there is one, for a show setting itself up to fail, I guess, with the fans that it has, right? Like what happens that beyond budget, beyond specific behind the scenes stuff, like how would you interpret like with the mishandling and that could lead to a mass rage quit, not just like individuals not liking particular episodes?
I think it has to be multiple incidents of mishandling, right? I think that's what I'm learning here, looking back on this, is it had to be the Trial of a Time Lord mishandling. It had to be, and then, what I saw is a terrible, terrible regeneration, real mishandling, Doctor Who movie kind of mishandled.
Well, also you mentioned McCoy, you're not really warming to him, but you thought it was miscast.
Miscasting, yes. And I never warmed to him, never had the opportunity to warm to him, really. It definitely, looking back at it, it really feels like the times I've had breakups. It has that same sort of emotional sense of like, oh God, I was really emotionally invested in this relationship. And now it's gone.
You don't break up over one fight.
Yes, exactly.
Generally.
It's a build-up of things. It's a build-up of stuff. And that's why I think like there's no kind of one clear moment in either rage quitting or meh quitting necessarily. I think you have to look at all this confluence of factors that kind of connect and build in.
Certainly not in meh quitting. I think that's almost inherent to it. There's no like thing that's just like, I'm just gonna, I'm so bored. I'm somehow like this specific thing has gotten me out. I think that's just not how it works. So thinking back to my own experience with the classic series, there's really only one time. There's one time I meh quit and one time I nearly rage quit.
So your experience with the classic series, we've talked about it on the show before. You started with Peter Davison.
That's correct. So it's very all over the place in some ways because the way the public television affiliate that we got in Edmonton was showing Doctor Who, because it was showing it in two ways. It was showing Peter Davison's individual episodes every single day, every weekday. And then on Saturday nights, you'd get essentially an omnibus version of a complete story. But these were Tom Baker episodes. So basically, I think I picked up Tom Baker right around Robots of Death or something like that. And this was right around the same time I started with Peter Davison as Modern Undead. That was the very first thing I ever saw with Doctor Who. And they went all the way to Caves of Androzani, and I saw the regeneration and, Change My Idea and Not a Moment Too Soon. And I really loved Davison so much. I was a little bit WTF at that point, even though I knew about regeneration. I'd been seeing Tom Baker. I knew successive actors took over the role. It wasn't a surprise to me. Your doctor, it dies and leaves you, and suddenly there's this other person who's claiming to be the doctor. And certainly with Colin Baker and his sort of attitude, even right off the bat, I was a little annoyed. But I was like, okay, I'm also excited to tune in for the next episode. I was like, super, I'm going to see how this goes. And sure enough, the next episode is Spearhead from Space. And again, I got to think that there's no internet. I barely looked at like program guides or whatever. Like I really didn't have a lot in the way of Doctor Who literature or reference books or at all. So certainly had never seen Doctor Who magazine. So when I saw those credits roll for Spearhead from Space, I had no idea this was something I was seeing from the 70s.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until we got about and you don't even really see Pertwee for the first little bit, right?
Right.
And it's really not until about 5 or 10 minutes in when you actually see him for the first time.
Stumbling out of the TARDIS, yeah.
Wait a minute, that's the guy from the Five Doctors. And then it dawned on me this is not the next episode, because I was also kind of wondering where Perry was and etc. And so, kind of an amusing thing. Okay, well then I realized they went back. It's obviously this is the third Doctor, and I was like, oh, okay, well, but Spirits with Space, compelling, and then they go right into the Silurians, which I absolutely loved, and so I was like, okay, I'm into this, and I stuck with Pertwee and kept watching that. Still the Tom Baker, there was a lot of Tom Baker still to go on those Saturday nights, so that I wasn't going to get into the modern era through that. But at some point in the Pertwee broadcasts, we got to around like the third season of Pertwee, and I think it was right around the Time Monster or the Mutants, where I kind of checked out. I kind of was like, all right, I'm a little tired of this. Like,
was it something about those stories in particular, or just the build up of?
I felt like it was getting a bit predictable, formulaic. I think that it's not like the stories aren't original, but that you get that familiar pattern when all the Pertwee stuff or any era, it just sort of starts to feel the same after a while, I think. And I think the better eras have highs and lows that wow you or disappoint you. And I feel like the middle of the Pertwee era is all very mid. It's all kind of, Sea Devils is pretty good, and the Time Monster is okay, and there's a
Carnival of Monsters didn't do it.
I think I checked out right around that, and so I kind of missed the three Doctors, Carnival of Monsters. A lot of that stuff I missed, and then on some random day, I decided to tune into Doctor Who again on the dailies, and I think this happened. It was like Tom Baker, and I realized, I'd missed the regeneration into Tom Baker, and I suddenly felt really bad. Like I'd missed this because I loved the idea of regeneration and what epic episodes they were, and having missed that sort of knocked me back into, oh no, I've got to keep up with this because
you already
really satisfied and see something really cool.
And you already knew Baker from those weekend stories, so you were missing the regeneration between two Doctors you already knew really well.
Yeah, so then I sort of recommitted at this point, and I watched a lot of Tom Baker, rewatched Davison, and then got to see Colin Baker. So, and it's just a weird quirk that I ended up seeing it this way, because I really did not like Colin Baker when I finally got a chance to see those episodes. And I feel like had I seen them right after the Davison stuff that I started with, I might have rage quit.
If you'd gone straight into Twin Dilemma.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And but at this point I was so sort of more committed fully to the vision and the sort of universe of the show that I was like, okay, well, at some point he'll regenerate again, or it'll get better, or whatever. I'm going to stick with this, and I did, and I kind of ended up liking the McCoy era. And again, I certainly wasn't rage quit, but I would just like to say, like, everything you said about like feeling like it's really on life support and it's hanging by a string and could fall apart at any time. I totally get that. That actually really feels right, especially like with the special effects in those later seasons. I mean, the budget was so severely cut. They were essentially just shining lights on things to make them look sci-fi-ish, and it's tough. You could tell they don't have a lot to work with back at that point.
Which doesn't necessarily, and we'll get into this next week with the War Games, but like that's an example of a serial where they did run out of money, but can still, Doctor Who is best can still make you really enjoy the show, even on a very slim budget. But the McCoy era didn't always do that. Maybe it was overly ambitious on the special effects front. But yeah, and then then the TV movie. Did you watch that? And
yeah, so it's funny. I had sort of my journalism career was just budding at the time of the TV movie. So I was working actually as an editor at my campus paper at the University of Alberta. And it just so happens I was the editor during, I think it came out in May. And I was the editor of the summer paper that summer. And I actually managed to get, and I think I still have it, like the press copy of the VHS tape. And I watched it with some friends of mine. And I was super hyped. I really wanted Doctor Who to come back. I kept, checking the entertainment section for news that it had been renewed, that they'd picked up the series, and obviously that never happened. But I really, really enjoyed the TV movie. Really liked Paul McGann's performance. Again, we'll get to it when we get to it, but. When
we hit that triple Yahtzee on the randomizer.
Yeah. Well, when it wasn't renewed, it felt further away than ever. And at this point, I was, finishing college. I was taking engineering. It was taking a lot of my time. I was trying to get more serious about my journalism career too. And honestly, Doctor Who just kind of fell a little bit in the background, along with everything, that was sort of peripheral in my life. And I honestly, during the wilderness years, I was really probably the most checked out I ever was from the show. And the only thing that really registered, even though I was sort of vaguely aware of Big Finish and the novels and stuff, I might have read one novel in that time. The only thing I really sort of took notice of, because it was such a phenomenon online, was Death Comes to Time. It was like, I think in 2000 when the BBC did sort of a webcast, one of the first ever webcasts of a show. Not really a show. I guess it was kind of like sort of quasi animated stuff. But it was sort of a webcast with visuals of an audio adventure. And I think I only listened to the first bit of it, and I've always been meaning to come back to it and watch it, like, as it's all on YouTube now. And I never have. I think at some point I will, just for historical purposes. But it just kind of fell to the background until the new series came out. And then I was excited about the new series, but as you have observed, it was actually rather difficult to watch here in North America. But the thing was, my sister back home in Edmonton recorded all of it. And when I came back home to visit her, I binged the whole thing, and it was just like, whoa, this is it. Like, it was just so satisfying as a fan, just to sort of see like it realized in this sort of high production values world that we were in. It was just like they got so much of it right. And again,
RTD gets it. Yeah.
And then that was it. I was finally back. They pulled me back in. Way to go, RTD. I was like, all right, I can be a fan of this again.
When I thought I was out. It's interesting.
Probably brings us to, well, since now we're on New Who, like I've never rage quit New Who, but I think as a show, Doctor Who, obviously showrunners or producers come and go. These inflection points, you identified one obviously with McCoy. For me, it probably would have been Colin Baker. When you have a new take on the show, just naturally lends itself to a rage quit if you're going to rage quit. And I think in in New Who, the natural point that has come is like the Chibnall era, just because it was so different. Like, I think the transition from Davies to Moffat was comparatively much more smooth, or at least from a tonal aspect, more consistent. Just in the way, because like they obviously worked together really closely, Moffat and Davies. They spoke a very similar language, thought about Doctor Who in similar ways, and even though their eras are distinct, certainly, and you can sort of see that through the style and the writing and sort of the interpretations of the show. As a fan, it's sort of like, oh, okay, you're kind of handheld into the Moffat era from the Davies era pretty pretty clearly.
You are, and there's that wonderful moment that I always think of in the writer's tale where they're working together of it and on it, and RTD emails Moffat to say, "Just let me know where you'd like me to park the Doctor." Wonderful phrase, and of course that transition was handled so well, and the 11th hour pulls out all the stops.
Yeah.
To really say, because of course they were making a big push into America at that point. To say, hey, a fresh new Doctor, really excited, new companions and new setup, and just like it's much more, and here's the whole history of the show seen through the eye of the Atraxi, and then Matt Smith steps into it. Like, it's very self-conscious moment of like, no, you're really gonna want to watch this. This is good. This is the same show, new guy, but like, stick with it. It's good.
It was convincing.
Yeah, totally. I mean, Matt Smith is probably the Doctor I had the least problem, imagining into the role of the Doctor, like in story one, right? I think he really just kind of nails it right there. But yeah, the new show, Chibnall, has been a problem for a lot. I'll tell you what, I talked to my wife about her meh quitting moments. I'll tell you what she said. First of all, after last Christmas, so she was one of the people who had an issue with Clara. And Clara, of course, we know, nearly left after last Christmas. And season 2 of Clara and Capaldi, starting with, I guess, the Sorcerer's Apprentice, yes. Right. Again, all the stops have been pulled out. Missy is back. So she didn't quite meh quit then, but at some point during that season, it was just like, Clara's just, I think for a lot of people, Clara was a jumping off point when she
maybe
kind of overstayed her welcome. Yeah.
Yeah.
There we go.
There.
Jinx.
Yeah. Yeah, I get that. It's interesting. Yeah, you could. It's interesting to pick out this, and also the point where Dave said he almost rage quit. Which was that middle of series 6, which I kind of understand, because that was a big risk-taking season. At least for Moffat. I mean, he hadn't done a structure like that before. There were some calls made to the story overall that were probably made more for their twistiness than character-driven, which all the Ganger stuff and the stuff around River and how people ended up reacting to that. I would agree. And then, Let's Kill Hitler is it's
a divisive one.
Yeah, we don't want to get into all of it, but I can definitely see why it's super divisive. It's taking this sort of thought exercise and that comes up in every college class and essentially abandons it and just does kind of a goofy story, which with a lot of physical comedy and also sort of nonsensical takes on things we've seen before, arguably nonsensical anyway, like with regeneration, I'm thinking of them specifically.
Right. It's a lot to digest.
Yeah, strangely.
And if you're not already on... Yeah, and if you're not already on board with the whole concept of River or the River storyline, I think... part of the problem for people like Dave, not to put words into his mouth, but he did mention the issue of the Moffat era of basically everyone fancies the Doctor. Everyone, and the Doctor's wife, but and this is just sort of like that whole season. You have to, if you're not into the relationship between the Doctor and River, you have to suffer through it all. Now, luckily, it worked for me. I really liked that season, but I can see the division. With the Chibnall era, I think it's a lot easier to see why people would rage quit. I think The Woman Who Fell to Earth does not do what the 11th Hour does, did not kind of pull out all the stops. It's not a bad story, but it's also not necessarily like, hey, Doctor Who's back, and it's maybe a little closer to the Twin Dilemma than the 11th Hour. I don't know. It's not quite there.
No, I tend to agree. And I think, to your point, I think it's not necessarily one thing. I think everyone was ready to forgive a less than great debut episode. but a less than great debut season,
Yeah.
at least as it was interpreted on first broadcast, I think is kind of where a lot of people just decided to fall off. I know at least one person personally. I mean, my sister, who is a big Doctor Who fan, kind of essentially left the show right then, and just basically she would say like, "Not my doctor," and I
Which is
wouldn't say I
such a
was
shame.
surprised.
Yeah.
I mean, they went on to do some really cool things with various individual episodes, but it definitely felt in some ways disrespectful to what had come before, even in the Davies and Moffat era, just because there were these sort of glossed over things with Unit. I guess that took a while. I think it was Resolution where they sort of said we're sort of not doing that. And I don't know, like I think at least Moffat was a little more careful early on to sort of establish why and how he would do his own thing. Like, the whole things with the cracks in time gives it. I see that a lot as him giving himself a blank check to do whatever he wants, but still giving an in-show reason for why things are inconsistent. And Chibnall never really quite did that. I mean, there's a couple of throwaway things, but it's like he's clearly interpreting his Doctor Who universe differently. And I don't mean just sort of the excuses for whether people remember alien invasions or not. I think it is just more tonally different. And you never really, it doesn't feel right. It just feels a little bit like sticks out like a sore thumb if you've been brought up on Davies and Moffat. And again, that's not to say like they shouldn't try to do different things. Obviously they should. It just, this one just didn't taste right.
And to this point of sort of you need various layers to rage quit. You need, it's not just one thing, right? The ground has to be prepared. So I think people were sort of like, season 1, but then Jodie's season 2, starting with Spyfall and starting with the sudden burning of Gallifrey. That was a meh quit for a lot of people, especially followed by Orphan 55. That's when my wife meh quit the season at that point. I kind of did too. I still have not seen Praxis and Can You Hear Me? I look at those every time I kind of look at that season. I'm like, we'll get to them when we get to them. Like I have no urge to watch them. Obviously, Fugitive the Jadoon was sort of a kind of a jumping back on point for a lot of people, like and then Timeless Children. Course that divided fandom badly, so it was really, that whole season was kind of a mess with people leaving or not being sure, rage quitting or meh quitting, or it just didn't feel like Chibnall did himself any favors in that season, and meddling with the lore of the show when we're kind of iffy about whether we're watching at all. It seemed like terrible timing.
And also, since he's, I guess you could argue, confessed ever since that he didn't really have much of a plan. It honestly feels even more disrespectful in some ways. Like if you're going to do such huge things as, burning out Gallifrey and upending the entire history of the central character, I mean, like I would have hoped it was just a little more thought through than I guess it turned out to be. Even things like the Master, right, where it really wouldn't have taken much to get a little bit of dialogue to acknowledge the Missy stuff that they were sort of trying to do, but they didn't even bother. If you're a longtime fan and you were invested in those storylines, it just feels like they weren't really cared for. He wasn't even a really good steward of that. And I wish he had thought more about sounds terrible. I was going to say thought more about legacy, but I don't know.
It's fair enough. It's a fair comment. You gotta think about how the show is going to be viewed by the future, and seen as a whole, and especially if you've lived through that cancellation era, as we all have, as Chibnall had. While we're talking about New Who, I think this might be a good time to bring in some comments from folks who are responding to the poll here that we put out. And the first one is kind of interesting because it does point out that a lot of this is not necessarily about us, right? It's it can often be about other stuff that we're going through. So, Sleeping Dalek, at Patrick Perring on Twitter, I know he's a friend of the show. He's commented before. He says, the closest I ever got was after watching The Husbands of River Song. I was going through a lot of negativity at the time, and I was putting that on my love for the show. I love the story now, but I left halfway through, very angry when it aired. So again, quitting in the middle of the episode, like that feels like that is a characteristic of rage quitting, right? You cannot even bring yourself to watch to the end. You're just so mad you have to turn the TV off. That may be the definition
to do. Honestly, like I wouldn't have picked that one. I can't even really see why it would enrage someone so much, because it is mostly just doing kind of a capstone on the river stuff. And there's
if you're into at that point, The one I will say, the one thing about Husbands of River Song that didn't ring true to me was her not taking so long to recognize Capaldi as a new regeneration, right? With her whole,
which is kind of the central gag, but also it just seems kind of nuts, given that she would be so familiar with the essence of what the Doctor is that she wouldn't just see that that's this guy.
Yes. So similarly, let me bring in another comment, because it has a similar vibe to it, but from the classic show. This is from Thinking Fish.
That's Martin.
Martin, who did our music. Yes. He says, I have a hazy recollection about watching a Sylvester McCoy scene. Maybe we can figure out what this is. Sylvester McCoy scene with a futuristic alien flying technology that was just a poorly disguised speedboat. And I was furious enough to get up, walk across the room, and stab the channel buttons, and didn't watch again until New Who arrived.
Wow. I'm trying to think what that was. I know there was like a disguised helicopter or something. I'm surprised they even had a helicopter, come to think of it, for Silver Nemesis.
Yeah.
Maybe it was Curse of Fenric? I don't know.
Could be. But again, that's the same thing that Sleeping Dalek is talking about, of like, you're so mad, you actually turn it off during the story. So that does seem to be almost the definition of rage quitting. You can't rage quit in the closing credits. You're clearly emotionally stable enough to watch the whole thing. It's not a rage quit. And then finally, we have a third reply to the poll. Stephen Arkley says, I struggled the most through the Matt Smith era, but I managed to stay on board. Which is,
I get that. Because I honestly like, there are parts of the Matt. I love Matt Smith, love a lot of his stories, but if you're used to Davies, I think, and I was definitely like this to some extent, and you get to that Moffat era where he's just more fast and loose with story. That, and I've said so on some of the episodes, what we've done there, that really pisses me off, frankly, like that he thinks he can do these emotional beats in the middle of stories without really earning them through the story. That's his, in my opinion, that's the worst quality of Moffat, as great as a lot of the stuff he's done is. And I could, I could see getting irritating if you see enough of those in a row, and then essentially rage quitting, or just, at the very least taking a break.
I do feel like Moffat plays with fire in that regard. I think I've had the opposite reaction to Moffat versus Davies. I feel like Moffat is more my style of storyteller. He is what I would do with Doctor Who if I was showrunner. Like, I just jam so many big thinky concepts into each episode because I'm just so enthusiastic to get them all in. So he was always more like, I warmed to Moffat more than a lot of people, I think. And didn't understand the people who almost quit with Matt Smith, but yeah, it's such a personal thing that we all have our own individual reasons, and for a lot of people, Matt Smith was too young.
Since we're talking about fans interacting with us on social media, I'm just going to take a moment to do a little housekeeping and remind everyone this is a podcast. And if you're not subscribed, and if you're somehow encountering this on a web embed or something like that, please find us in your podcast app and hit that subscribe button. The only better thing you could do is share this podcast with a friend who may love Doctor Who and not have rage quit it yet. So
yes,
give
prepare
them a
them.
reason. No.
Prepare them for the inevitable rage quitting that will happen at some point. I'm sure there will people who will rage quit Shooty's tenure, right? There's always
yeah, for
a
sure.
contingent who, dislike whatever new Doctor that comes along.
Yeah, exactly. Whenever there's an era of change, it's going to attract new fans, and old ones are going to leave. It's just how it goes. It's the beauty of Doctor Who in some ways. I mean, yes, there's long-term fans, a lot of them, but it has a built-in reboot. That's the whole thing about it. Yes, it's all one universe, but tonally, even almost genre-wise, it can change completely from producer to showrunner. I mean, if you look back at the Philip Hinchcliffe era, right, that gets cited a lot. It kind of became a horror show for a while,
right? And then Hinchcliffe to Graham Williams was a big tonal shift, right in the middle of the Baker era.
And JNT, man, nothing more 80s than a little JNT Doctor Who.
Yeah.
Reminder, Spotify listeners, you can rate the show on your app. Go ahead and fire that up. You can rate the show and individual episodes with a star rating. If you subscribe on a podcast app, hey, why not also subscribe on YouTube? We're at youtube.com/pulltoopen and join the discussion there. We get a lot of good comments about the show on YouTube. And of course, stay tuned to our TikTok channel, Pull to Open, for all of our videos that we cut on our episodes. We get videos there almost every day. And Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Pull to Open 63 is the handle.
Speaking of Twitter, let's check in on the poll. And the options in the poll were, well, the question was, have you ever rage quit the show or stopped watching because meh? And the first option was yes, rage quit. 31.3% of respondents to the poll have said that yes, they have rage quit the show. 18.8% said they have meh quit the show. Nobody said that they've done both at different times. So it's either one or the other for all our respondents. And a full 50% of respondents have said loyal since I began, which I guess would be your answer, Pete. That would, I'd be in the rage quit category, or maybe both at different times. You'd be loyal since you began, just about.
I guess it depends how much that Pertwee quit is a meh quit. It was kind of a meh quit. I was younger, certainly, and maybe just thought I was busy. But yeah, pretty much loyal since I began. So just I remember that awakening in me when I realized I'd missed the Tom Baker thing. It was just like, oh yeah, like I'm a fan of this show. Like that just the feeling you have, like, oh, I missed something important. And
you're making me wonder if there's a layer below, tier below meh quitting, which is just quiet quitting. I quiet quit Doctor Who. Not necessarily because I thought the show was bad. I just I was sort of nominally still a fan, but just checked out in some other way.
So I think I'd want to say one more thing about the Chibnall meh quit, rage quit era, just because I think it's a little bit instructive. And I'd compare it to, here's where I'd start to sort of bring in other shows, right? Because as I was thinking about this discussion we were going to have, I thought about other shows I've rage quit. And there have been several shows, frankly. So the one that comes to mind immediately is Heroes. So Heroes, obviously, I don't think it's really talked about much anymore, but in the mid 2000s, it was a really popular show for at least a season. So the first season of Heroes, this superhero show, even before the current, what I would say, crop of superhero movies came out. This was sort of during the 1.0 superhero era, during the original Spider-Man movies and stuff like that.
Pre-MCU.
Yeah, Heroes was a big deal, and it was a surprise hit in the first season. It was surprisingly great in the first season. And I don't think I have to think really hard about a show that really fell very quickly from a peak, because season 2, even though it was marred a bit by, I think, a writer's strike at the time, so it was shortened, was just a huge miss. Yeah. And it just kept missing and missing. And I remember moments in season 2, well, first of all, from an emotional level, you feel the change from kind of watching a show to hate watching it.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah, Heroes. Yeah, I had that same experience, and I will say that. So, season 1, I think it's partly to do with the brilliance of season 1, right?
Mm-hmm.
But also, they kind of wrapped it up really neatly. That whole save the cheerleader, save the world thing.
And that's with the brothers,
yeah.
and that final episode, it all just kind of everything hit right. And then, picking it up on season 2.
Where could they go from there?
Well, they kind of, what I didn't like about it, like, I mean, I could get into all the details, but they immediately sort of reversed themselves on something they'd sort of explicitly said, which is that you can't reverse or program into basically turn someone who's not a superhero into a superhero or vice versa. And then they just basically say, oh, yes, you can. That was that's spider sense goes off, number one. But they kept doing decisions like that. And you kind of started to wonder, like, do they even know what the rules or structure of this universe is? And then there was a moment to me that proved they didn't, which was there was a character who had the same power as the cheerleader who could heal themselves. They were super old. They were like hundreds of years old. And then there was kind of like a moment where he loses his powers. I forget why. And then he immediately ages like 300 years and dies. And I just, for a moment, that's when I thought, wait a second, hold on. And I know this is getting fan nerdy, but it was like, I realized the power doesn't work that way. Yeah. It's not like if Claire, who was the cheerleader, lost her powers, suddenly every single wound she'd ever had would suddenly reappear. That's just ridiculous. And that's essentially kind of what they were saying with this instant aging. And it's that point I thought, are the people making this show, are they even fans of their own show? And that's when it dawned on me, they weren't. They just didn't care. They were just doing whatever and not really paying any heed to how fans would like it, react. They were just doing kind of whatever they thought was sort of interesting in to them anyway. And that's kind of what I rage quit. That it
was clearly NBC like knew they had a hit on their hands. They basically told the writers, find some way of extending it. It doesn't matter how, just like keep the show on the air, right?
Yeah.
So that was very obvious to me too. And I think to a lot of people, I think what we're discovering here is like this is very similar to the Trial of the Time Lord problem, right? The show somehow explicitly ignoring its own rules. And you just sort of look around the living like, what are you treating me like an idiot? What is this? How can I still love this if it is so clearly illogical according to its own logic? And I sort of feel like, Lost was the same for a lot of people.
Well,
it had a similar vibe.
I'd separate Lost a bit because I think it fails for different reasons, because I have absolutely no doubt the people making the show were fans of their own show, which is I think it was Carlton Cuse, Damien Lindelof, or the two people.
Yes.
And so they've given a lot of interviews, and the way they thought about the show, I think, shows that they were fans, but they made some just questionable decisions. And I think one of them, I mean, I'm not going to get into the specifics of that show, but to have so many of the actual mysteries not really answered, that general approach that they took, I think ultimately frustrated a lot of people. And I think it was just like there should have been a few more clear answers, both along the way and at the end.
Did you like the time travel season? I was a big fan of season 5. The time travel season.
The time travel season was pretty good. It definitely led to some really great stuff. I think The Constant was the big sort of episode in that season. That's like the Viscount banger of that.
Absolutely,
that show. So I, in other words, like, and that's also the fact that I knew that they were fans of the show, and that was very evident in sort of the details and the storytelling and that stuff. I'd actually never rage quit Lost. There were times I was sort of not really keeping up with it as closely, but I watched it all the way to the end. And Yeah.
I don't think it counts. Lost and I think also Game of Thrones slots into the category of people, like, you can't rage quit with the last episode, right? It doesn't quite count. If you've gotten all the way through it, and a lot of people didn't like the last season of Game of Thrones, I'm kind of an outlier on that one. I do think they kind of stuck the landing in a story that was very, very difficult to stick the landing in. So I have some sympathy for that. But yeah, that's a different thing. If you get to the end and you don't like the story, that's not rage quitting.
So bringing it back around, I mean, this is kind of where I interpret the quitting of the Chibnall era, right? In that it did become, like, I'm not saying Chibnall's not a fan. He's just kind of a different kind of fan than Davies and Moffat, I think, and certainly different from myself, and cared about different things in what he was doing or trying to do during that era. And so I would probably draw an analogy between Lost and that era, I guess, as opposed to Heroes. But I would, there was some disconnect between what I think Doctor Who should be and what Chibnall should be. The Venn diagram there was not as aligned with the previous two as it was with the previous two showrunners.
Yeah.
And so, like, I never rage quit, but I was definitely not enthusiastic about a lot of the Whittaker era. And I'm sort of super glad to sort of revisit those episodes on an individual basis now with the podcast, because now that I can sort of remove it on a case-by-case basis from that era, a lot of them are a lot better than I remember.
Yeah, we cannot rage quit Pull to Open. We hope you do not rage quit Pull to Open either. I will say that I feel like maybe part of the subconscious inspiration for this short trip was the fact that, it has the randomizer been taking us to some curious picks recently. The Smugglers, interestingly, we're watching the War Games for next week and discovered that the War Games, like, was really, a lot of people were rage quitting at that time, right? Or not even rage quitting, back quitting. Like, the ratings were really low. They were as low, almost as low as the lowest rated of the classic series, which was The Smugglers. We've been there. It does feel like sometimes the randomizer is trying to throw us off and trying to show us, like, the worst of the show, or at least until we got to the War Games. So it feels like this is a good time to talk about this question of Doctor Who not always being up to scratch, and being a thing that we love so much that isn't always represented as we would like to see it on the screen, and causing us to have this strong emotional reaction.
Yeah, and I think it sort of almost speaks to a little bit what we were talking about before we were recording, which is like the show kind of rage quits itself. Yes. A couple times, and you could argue the War Games is one of those, even though it's not at all. I'm not talking at all about the quality of that particular story. It's more like it infamously, the show was very, like, on a hanging by a string at that point, and right. They were making way too much of it. Yeah, fewer people watched the War Games than Survival. Like, the actual last stories, in the McCoy era, actually had more viewers than they had at the War Games phase. Inferno was, I mentioned that briefly, that perhaps one of the most likely points in the classic series prior to the McCoy era and the Baker era, where it could have been cancelled. And, it does sort of famously end with the Doctor trying to rage quit the Brigadier and Liz Shaw by disappearing with the TARDIS console, and then it turns out he can't even rage quit himself. He did too good a job in that season, or just too many bangers, and it was just like, you know what, this is too good now. We can't quit it. Yep. So and Troughton in the War Games, we'll discuss this next time, but yeah, he definitely has that moment at the end where it's sort of like he's so resigned to his fate that he can't even pick a body to regenerate into. He's just like, it's sort of the equivalent of Capaldi going, "I will not change," which is kind of interesting. Those moments where the Doctor's like, "I'm tired of being the Doctor. I'm going to rage quit myself. I'm not going to regenerate." He is a reluctant one to turn the page, to wrap things up. But you know what? We're not going to be like that here on Pull to Open. Nice. So we appreciate everyone who has been listening and has not rage quit this episode. And we would just like to say, come on back next week for the War Games. Follow us on social. I won't go over all that again. Just Google Pull to Open. You'll find us.
Google it.
And we'll see you here next time.
All right. See you guys.